Hello everybody, welcome. My name is Raina Ogren and I'm the chair of the Primary Care Diabetes Society of Australia and a podiatrist and researcher with a special interest in diabetes. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting around the country, and in my case, I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri peoples. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Sovereignty of the lands we're on has never been ceded. We strive to reduce the impact of diabetes on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people living in Australia. Thank you all for attending today's webinar, one of a series that Primary Care Diabetes Society is presenting in collaboration with the NADC on a family-friendly timetable every second Thursday during lunchtime in school semesters. And we'd really like to thank NADC for all their support in enabling us to hold these webinars. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Catherine Whitney, who will be presenting on diversity and person-centred care, what primary care providers need to know. And Catherine Whitney is a Senior Advisor in Diversity and Inclusion at Bolton Clark, and she joined the team in 2022 and has a broad educational and work history, including a Bachelor of Science in Honours, leading to work in health and social research, followed by completion of a Bachelor of Occupational Therapy, and more recently a Masters of Science in Public Health, focusing on health equity and diversity. As a senior occupational therapist, she worked for many years in community aged care and the NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Catherine believes that high-quality, inclusive aged care is a human right and is encouraged by the momentum this perspective is gaining towards improving the lives of older people. Thank you all for coming today, and please remember to use the Q&A to put in questions, and Catherine can answer them at the end. And so I would like to welcome Catherine Whitney. So Catherine has just joined the room. Catherine, I'd like to welcome you to present now.
Thank you, Raina. I'm sorry I missed part of that welcome introduction. So thanks everybody for taking the time out to be here today. I'll do my very best for you to remain interested and perhaps learn something. So the topic today is diversity in person-centred care, what primary care providers need to know. Firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people as the traditional owners of the country on which I present here today. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend my respect to all First Nations people, including those with us today. So today's session, I'll just give you a little brief intro as to why I'm interested in this area. I'm an occupational therapist by background, and I did a Master of Public Health in a past lifetime, focusing on health equity. And my thesis actually focused on bias within the type 2 diabetes clinical guidelines for general practice. I used a tool called the bias-free framework to investigate the guidelines for the existence of gender bias, race bias, and socioeconomic bias, and found that, in fact, the guidelines were riddled with bias throughout. This is the 2015 guidelines. I might just highlight, as I said, it was a past lifetime. An example of one of the biases was using language like good evidence to support patient access across a variety of healthcare professionals, which is an overgeneralization of information from a dominant perspective, because the evidence in fact shows that most disadvantaged groups have poor access to healthcare professionals. So that's kind of why I'm interested in the area. I actually now work fully in the aged care diversity space. So I have worked as an OT and a health coach in the past. I've done motivational interviewing and various other chronic disease self-management frameworks. So yeah, this has been a nice exercise to go back and refresh myself in those spaces. So I'd like to give you some key points to consider in your practice, some opportunity to reflect, which is a key aspect of person-centred practice, of course, on yourself and your team or your organisation's position on diversity and inclusion, and give some definitions, I suppose, of diversity and person-centred care, and also just consider some calls to action. So who is diverse in our communities? There are over 420 languages spoken in Australia, including 183 Indigenous languages. The top 5 languages other than English are Mandarin, Arabic, Vietnamese, Cantonese, Punjabi. Around 37% of people over 65 were born overseas. The 2021 census indicated more than 120 religions and faiths, and our workforce is incredibly diverse as well. 1 in 17, or 6% of people in 2017 census reported a diverse sex and or gender identity who are older Australians. Now, this is likely to be highly underrepresentative, and it wasn't even included as a question in the 2021 census. So you may consider that diversity is already part of your practice if you consider your own current clients and your wait lists, and of course they are. So why do we need to actually focus on knowing more about the diverse communities that we work with? I really like this slide. Of course, the first picture there is represents equality, that everybody benefits from the same supports. The middle frame indicates that everyone gets the support they need. So you can notice the box there representing the supports that people need so that everybody can get the same. And in the final pane is where the causes of the inequity are addressed, or the systematic barrier has been removed. I actually had another a pictorial demonstrating this that had a wheelchair, but the gradient of the ramp on the wheelchair was just far too much for my OT sensibility, so I've gone with this one instead. Now, I've heard this before in training and around the traps and out in the field. I work in a person-centered way, so therefore I understand diversity. I might argue that if you understand diversity, then you have a framework to do person-centered care well, but they're not mutually exclusive. You cannot do one well without the other. There's probably some very experienced clinicians in the room at the moment who might do person-centered care in their sleep or use a narrative approach or another way of explaining person-centered care. So I hope that the next little section here where I go over person-centered care definitions as such, either you can use the time to reflect on your own practice or perhaps consider that you might use some of the tools that I'm about to show you by way of supervision or in orientation or training for other staff. So very broadly, there are many models of person-centered care. As we all know, no discipline owns the framework. Person-centered care is widely recognised as a foundation to safe, high-quality healthcare. It is care that is respectful of, responsive to the preferences, needs and values of the individual patient. It involves seeking out, understanding what's important to the patient, fostering trust, establishing mutual respect and working together to share decisions and planning care. Key dimensions include respect, emotional support, physical comfort, information, communication, continuity and transition, care coordination, involvement of carers and family, and access to care. We can do all of that, of course. But how do you do it? So here are some examples of some really cool tools that you may know or may in fact use, as I say, with supervision for others. Now, I've got no affiliation whatsoever with Helen Sanderson and Associates. Let me say that in the outset. I just happen to really quite like their tools. They're really quite simple. They've got a lot of free resources, so you in fact can go to the website and have a look around yourself. I'll just go through each of these very briefly. So one-page profiles. These are probably my favourite tools, really. For those who can't advocate for themselves well or need help to advocate for themselves, the process of doing a one-page profile can be really revealing, and it's a highly effective way to have a snapshot of your client and what's important to them. What's important to and important for? There's nothing complicated whatsoever about this template. You can see it's just 2 columns of important to and important for. But in fact, the process of going through asking someone what is important to them and what is important for them can help the clinician understand, do I go hard on recommending XYZ for this client, or is that just absolutely not valuable to them or not meaningful to them? And in fact, we can discover something else that is. It's really great for building trust and rapport also. Good day, bad day, again, not that complicated. Good day, bad day is a tool that basically shows people, what a good day reveals to them, or what is to them. It's a process that can also build rapport with a client. And it's an opportunity for them to talk about themselves and talk about things that matter to them, rather than being scolded for their blood sugar levels, for example. What's working and not working? Again, this is another tool that's very effective if there's been a breakdown in communication, or you're finding that a client isn't picking up what you're putting down, or you've just inherited a client perhaps, and you want a good way to find a benchmark to start working with them. This is then a really simple tool to use. So let's assume that you apply certain person-centered practice you follow your preferred chronic disease self-management theory, you engage motivational interviewing, provide education to inspire behaviour change, do all the right things. What are some barriers to all this going well? For example, getting actual good patient outcomes. Could I just ask you to perhaps put into the chat some ideas of barriers that that might come to mind that impact the patient outcomes? Some that I'm thinking of in particular would be language barriers. Is a really obvious one. Perhaps health and digital literacy barriers. Access, including affordability, availability of services. Perhaps there's something missing in your staff training or your rapport building, or even in your intake processes. Do people feel safe even being here? Do they feel welcome? Something else that I'd just like to ask you all is about another barrier, which could be unconscious bias. Oh, this is missing my picture. This had a really lovely picture here, so my apologies for that. Fundamental to understanding diversity is unconscious bias. Unconscious bias is favoritism toward or prejudice against people of a particular ethnicity, gender, or social group that influences your actions or perceptions. I might ask you, Lay, to play a little clip. It only goes for a couple of minutes, and then we're going to ask you your impressions of the clip and whether you might use it in your practice following that. So if you'd like to play that for me, please.
Diversity is about recognising that everybody is unique. When it comes to embracing diversity, the first step is to understand our own biases and prejudices, because we all have them. Have you ever spoken a little louder to someone who appears older? Have you ever spoken a little slower to someone who appears to come from a different country? As healthcare professionals, rather than treating everyone equally, we should treat people fairly. It's important to understand the context of a person's situation as well as their perspective. It may be different to your own. You must make sure you are conscious and respectful of how people wish to interact. Use inclusive language. For example, rather than saying, "Do you suffer depression?" why don't you say, "Are you living with depression?" placing the person, importantly, before the condition and removing any negative connotations. Challenge your assumptions. Remember, many older people can use modern technology. And if someone isn't engaging with you, don't assume them to be rude. They may just not be able to hear you. Questioning your assumptions is not always easy. We all have unconscious biases. It's natural for our brain to categorize our first impressions of someone based on characteristics like their age, weight, gender, or skin color, which can sometimes lead to incorrect assumptions. It's important to remember that individual characteristics do not define a person. Rather, it is the combination of these traits that makes each person unique and special. Let's work together to raise awareness of bias and prejudice, to celebrate diversity in its broadest sense, remembering always that we are more alike than we are different. Visit our website to learn more about diversity.
Thank you. Raina, you're going to launch a little poll for us. Might you like to do that just now?
Just launched it, and so let's see what people come up with. It's 100%. Oh, no, hang on. I'll give you a minute. I love the looking at the poll. I don't know if everybody else can see it, but it kind of wavers between.
Okay.
So far we've got 62% said yes, or 66 now, and 30% would consider it. Hang on.
Not for that.
It's hovering. Give us another half a minute. Hang on. I think I'm going to stop the poll now. So it's 61% yes, and 40%, 62% yes, and 40% consider it.
That sounds very positive. And look, using this type of thing in your, or questions of this nature in your recruitment or in your interviewing processes, or giving out to all staff as a bit of a team building exercise, or certainly as part of every orientation program, you could do no wrong than to include that there. And you certainly do not need to use that example, although that one is freely available. There are others that might be more meaningful for you. So just have a look for those. This figure you may have seen before. It actually falls out of the Aged Care Diversity Framework from 2017. So this is, as I mentioned earlier, an area that I work really closely in. The Aged Care Diversity Framework sets out actions to ensure that aged care services meet the needs from people from diverse backgrounds. It takes a human rights-based approach, which encourages partnership in design and implementation of care. The framework sets out to ensure that aged care services are safe and respectful, and the framework is, of course, linked with the Aged Care Quality Standards, which is the accreditation for funded aged care services. There may or may not be many people who are familiar with the Aged Care Quality Standards. If you're in a large organisation with aged care funding, then certainly you will be. But just if you're thinking, oh, this is not relevant to me, the principles that we're going to discuss just now are really the same across all healthcare sectors. So if you've not come across this before, or if this doesn't seem, if you've not seen these pictorials or the information, then just apply it to the work that you're doing. Even if you're in private practice, it's something that you could borrow or go to all of the resources on the aged care website, because it really is quite a hyper focus, particularly since the Royal Commission, which really highlighted some serious issues in aged care providers meeting the needs of diverse populations. So I'm not sure how well you can all read each of the little circles there, but I thought I might just go around each of the circles to give a little bit of a highlight and reference to diabetes in primary care in particular. So people from COLD backgrounds obviously means people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and we know that there's a disproportionate burden of diabetes amongst migrant groups in this country. There's a nuance, of course, amongst these groups, so you should know your population and find out about what those cultural or nuance differences are. LGBTI people, the CHSP manual, which is an aged care framework, has updated their acronym to be LGBTQIA+ now. So there are protocols around using this type of language, and you should know them and you should embed them into your policies and procedures and update them as needed, because they do change. I have seen in care plans across my working life, 72-year-old gentleman used to be gay. So, there really is a lot of awareness that you may think that you do this sort of thing, but you've got to make sure that your staff do as well. People who live in rural or very remote areas, we know that diabetes death rates as the underlying or associated cause is doubled in remote and very remote areas compared with major cities. This is according to 2018 data. So this is a major national crisis and obviously something that needs a lot of focus. People with mental health problems and mental illness. Australians with diabetes have a higher prevalence of poor mental health and wellbeing than those without diabetes, and of course we know that they can influence each other. So it's not something that we just should know in the background and you've learned about it, in training or in your, in your PD. It really does impact every single client that comes through your door. So you need to be considering those potentials. People living with a disability, again, it may not be very visible. We need to consider the detail of disability and diabetes together. Are we guilty of ableism? I've also seen in care plans, older gentlemen used to have autism, these sorts of things. The impacts of other psychosocial disability, misunderstood behaviours of concern, hoarding, anxiety, psychosocial disability, and not using NDIS as a proxy for disability, because of course many people with disabilities don't have access to the NDIS. Parents separated from their children by forced adoption or removal. This is trauma and intergenerational trauma. It is real and impactful and highlights the need for all healthcare services and professionals to really work in a trauma-informed way. And I would hope to inspire you that if you've not done a webinar on trauma-informed care in your practice, then maybe that might be something to put down, for a later date. Care leavers. I'll give you a definition of care leavers in case that's a new term for you. A care leaver is a person who spent time in care as a child under the age of 18. This care could have been foster care, residential care, mainly in children's homes, or another arrangement outside immediate or extended family. The care could have been provided directly by the state or through a court order, or voluntarily, or by the private sector. More than 500,000 people were placed in institutional and out-of-home care under various arrangements in the not-too-distant past. Care leavers may also be known as forgotten Australians, former child migrants, or stolen generations. Aged care, especially residential aged care, has been identified as an area of particular anxiety for care leavers, given their previous experiences of institutional care. The Australian Government has developed the Caring for Forgotten Australians, Former Child Migrants and Stolen Generations, and the Information Package for aged care providers to help them understand and support care leavers Again, whilst aged care may not be your area of primary care, the principles are the same, and certainly there would be people in your caseload who may have been affected by this, and it's important that you're certainly not asking questions of this in your assessment, but working in a trauma-informed way would really reveal how to work best with people with that sort of trauma in their background, or any trauma for that matter. People who are homeless or at risk of becoming homeless, if this is an issue that's growing in your community, then your organisation or your practice needs to know about it. It's hugely impactful for people, and the largest growing cohort in Australia is women over the age of 45. What's their opportunity for healthy or positive ageing if their highest priority, being shelter, is not met? The next little circle there, veterans. So we often think of the image of a senior man with his medals from World War II versus a much younger cohort of veterans with complex mental health and psychosocial disabilities who are sadly not as well looked after by the DVA as we would hope, and they certainly could make their way into your practice. Socio or economic disadvantage. This is broader than financial status. Unemployment or underemployment, being dependent on income support, people with low educational attainment, those living in public housing, and those living with a long-term health concern or disability, all form the definition offered in the 2013 Productivity Commission titled Deep and Persistent Disadvantage in Australia. So reflect again upon your current caseload for a moment. Are there equitable accommodations made to remove these structural barriers for optimal healthcare and outcomes for clients who come across your work? Again, relating back to diabetes, the death rates as the underlying or associated cause more than doubled for people with socioeconomic disadvantage amongst those living in low socioeconomic areas compared to those in higher socioeconomic areas. So again, the issue is real. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, by virtue of this topic already is potentially using offensive language. It should be Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people. They are, of course, different groups. It's like maybe assuming that all cold groups are the same. So have a look at your intake forms and the data that you're collecting. Are you doing that correctly? Because it's really very, very important. You should have a policy on its own about this area of work, and I do not claim for one moment that I'm the best person to present all of the information that you need to know about this group. Again, I might suggest that it's another topic for consideration. We certainly do know, of course, that Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people experience a much higher, 4 times higher burden compared to non-Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people in this country. Some of you may have heard of a diversity action plan. If you worked perhaps in the good old days of the HAC service before the health service went to the Commonwealth, then a diversity action plan would have been a mandatory thing to submit to the Victorian government. It's a plan that forces your organisation and your staff to have the knowledge and applicable information to deliver services in an inclusive way. There's no strict methodology for doing this. I've actually just kind of come up with a couple of ideas here for your consideration. But if you're thinking to yourself that your service or your team or your organisation or even your sole practice doesn't have a diversity action plan, then here are some ideas for where you might begin. Certainly if you're the sole practitioner, you might ask yourself, the board, whether you would like to commence such an activity. Do you have diversity and inclusion mission statements or statements of intent? for your business? Do you have policies and procedures that fall out of that? Do you know your community? Are you collecting population data? Are you identifying priority groups amongst where your service is located? Are you in any partnership or co-design relationships with those priority groups? What in fact do you do well, and what needs attention? Do you have diversity in your staff? Is it representative of the community in which you work? And your staff development. What's their own sense of inclusion or belonging? Because that really matters. Use of interpreters. Is this standard? Is this easy? I actually have had a lot of feedback just in the past weeks of Bolton Clark's use of interpreters, and just the frustration of them being cancelled. There is actually a really huge workforce strain in systems at the moment, so it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do them. In fact, we should maybe take the time to highlight just how important they are and keep persisting. But you know, this solving the workforce issue in this way is not easy. Is inclusive language present in all your recruitment, position descriptions and orientation processes? And how are you viewed from the outside, from your referrers? Is your website inclusive? And are you in fact an employer of choice? Sorry, I have... Leah, are you able to give me my next, there we are, thank you, my next slide. Now, I don't mean for you to read through this very small print here. It's merely an example to show you a really great resource that exists from the Centre of Cultural Diversity and Ageing that highlights training topics and indeed I would argue sort of policy and procedure topics that you might consider if you are working in an inclusive way in your service. Could you pop me the next slide, please? Thank you. So don't assume that you know. It's okay to respectfully ask. You really do need to understand your diversity data. Again, that Centre for Cultural Diversity and Ageing has a really great practice guide for collecting diversity data. Are the images that you're using on your website and on your brochures inclusive? Is the language that you're using is inclusive? It really does matter because you can be discriminating against your client group and consumers or potential consumers. If you're a researcher amongst the group today or a policymaker, be inclusive in your research methodology, your participant recruitment and your protocols. All too often we see limitations as part of a research paper that says, you know, we only used white white college students to, in this study. Too expensive to use anybody else. I mean, we really need to call out this sort of stuff because it really does impact what we're doing. If anyone has any political influence in the room, alone or together, then agitate to get TIS-funded translations and interpreters for the primary care practitioners. I would absolutely stomp my feet and wave my arms on that one. And start somewhere. From little things, big things grow. So don't be afraid to not know all the answers. But yeah, as I say, starting somewhere is a really good beginning. Thank you. Are there any questions or comments?
Thank you so much, Catherine. A few of the people, when you asked to post some barriers, had put in some of the things that you'd outlined in that circle, and those with Miles Fletcher said housing and living circumstances were a big area that potentially are barriers. Disability and being unable to exercise, because obviously with diabetes, that's a really important thing, and that would be a significant impact. Access to technology is another, and Natalie, that was Peter Cam, and Sophie Eldridge spoke about the disability. Natalie Wisher mentioned about the access to transport to attend services. Sophie Eldridge mentioned social isolation. That is a huge thing. It's an area of of a great interest to me. And then Danielle Plush mentioned a patient's mindset. And Quincy Tse put patients unwilling to pay for follow-ups.
Mm.
So there's a few things that were raised there, but I wondered around, because what you've mentioned things in isolation, and each of these individuals mentioned one aspect, but we know people tend to have a multitude of things happening together. So someone might have diabetes, and there's all that stigma associated, especially with type 2 diabetes. They might be an older person, so ageism is then coming into play. They might be from a culturally and linguistically diverse background, so racism comes to play. They might be a female, then sexism comes to play, and then with a low socioeconomic background, which means, you know, they've got all of these barriers to being able to access that high quality care. How do you tie that in together and actually try and figure out the best way to come at this person so that you are mindful of all of these things, so that that person has feels that they're in a place that you can help?
Yeah, that's right, Raina. It's not an exact recipe, and you can only arm yourself. You can't know the nuances of every single cultural tradition and or, you know, cultural idea about diabetes or you know, diet and you know, all the different cultural practices related to lifestyle choices, I suppose. But I mean, some of the points that we talked about in terms of understanding the population in which you work, that might be a little more revealing than just sort of flying blind, is really trying to understand, are there lots of people in my community who present from this particular cultural group or cultural identity that I can actually find some more information about. And like I said at the end there, just asking respectfully and fessing up that you don't know what you don't know. It's okay to do that. It helps put people at ease, of course. But yeah, that intersectionality, that term intersectionality, is about not applying one single lens. Yeah, we can't afford to do that if we want to really build that rapport with our clients and get better outcomes.
And there are, but they're also, so each council will have information about the population group that are in that region. So that's a place that we can source. You don't have to do all of that searching yourself. Are there other resources that people can access so that they can get a sense of who's in their community, Catherine?
Yes, absolutely. There are very many. In fact, I'm not sure that I have some of those that are just springing to mind just now in the resource list, but I think that I will get those to you. There's I can't think of the name of it just now, but it's a social like a social data enterprise that has got lots of information in that space that you can literally plug in your postcode. But certainly, as you say, your local council is a really great place to start. And they should have information on their own constituents for sure.
And the other one is I've noticed also the primary health networks. They do a needs analysis for the local community, and they're a broader region that they take. So that's another port of call that people can go to so that they can get a better understanding of the population group that might be that they might see. So that might be helpful.
Yeah.
Greg Fife said, I've noticed in recruitment, onboarding staff, in quotation marks, is a term in use. Is it just me that finds this a depersonalising term? Thoughts, Catherine?
Oh, look, I it does sound rather depersonalising. I like to, I wouldn't like to use that term myself, although I have often referred to Bolton Clark as a really big ship, so I did feel like I was onboarding in a sense when I commenced in this organisation, as big as it is, kind of 12 weeks ago or so. But yeah, no, that's just being mindful of the language that you're using in all settings is really, a place to stop and think. So yeah, I applaud you.
I was just also wondering, because you mentioned about that the lovely resources and the tools that they use, and I wonder whether any of the audience they might note down, do they use any structured tools that help them think through those processes, and what other resources that you come across, Catherine, that might help people, because it's hard. You're focused as a clinician on trying to deal with a health problem, and you've got all of these other issues that, because that person is more than their condition, and you've got to somehow navigate those other priorities. And unless you deal with what's top of mind for the individual, then the other things that are important as a healthcare provider simply won't get a look in. And so it's almost so it's just, how does one kind of draw from individuals what are those things that most impact on their ability to be able to consider their condition and what might help them in that way.
Oh, look, absolutely. All of those things are really real. And the elephant in the room, of course, is time and how much time you have to spend with a client. But you just cannot underestimate the power of taking the time to learn more about your client, which is where some of those person-centered tools, as kind of simplistic as they might seem, could be a really effective way to spend a session to learn more about a client. It can't be more important. And of course, in primary care, where the aim is to try to keep people out of hospital and aging well before they get to my sector, where they're so unwell that they require so much support to remain independent at home, or worse still, not able to remain at home and go on to residential aged care. So it really is the primary care space is the space where that time needs to be taken. I can't tell you how many times as an OT that I went to visit people in their own homes, and you say, oh, hello, what's been happening for you? Oh, I've had an operation. Or what was that about? Oh, I'm not sure, on my back. And they don't know what the operation was for. They don't know the medication that they're taking. So the primary care space is where that explanation of what's going on for a person really needs to happen. We can't assume that people actually even understand what diabetes means or does to their bodies. So yeah, if you could be inspired to just take a little bit more time, then that would be wonderful. Is everyone rolling their eyes? I can't see.
But it is that point of it takes a bit of time to do that, but it then saves time down the track in order to be able to address or build that rapport sufficiently in order to be able to then tackle those things with working with that person. But again, you need to have those few minutes early on and consistently. And as a podiatrist, we were lucky in a way because we'd see people on a regular basis and they have to be sitting in their chair for at least 20 minutes, feet up. They can't run away. And so you literally have ample opportunity to be able to start to have a discussion and find out more about these individuals and their lives and draw out what matters to them and then try and work through. And it gives you a better understanding then of why things haven't happened despite you trying to explain things and why they haven't taken them up, because there's other things in their lives that have impacted them. And Sophie Eldridge raised the social isolation aspect, and a lot of work has been done identifying that people feeling increased loneliness and social isolation is now equated to having the health impacts of smoking.
Yeah.
And so, so even that we somehow need to bring into the fold of our asking the people that we see, how connected are they with others? And, so it's like, goodness me, how do we cover all of that in our discussions with these community members and feeling, and which is a big load on healthcare providers. So how do we as healthcare providers cope with all of that?
No, absolutely. I think podiatrists and hairdressers have a lot of closures happen to them because, it's kind of that time where people are sitting and reflecting on what they say next. So just, turn your practice into a podiatry clinic and or a hairdresser and see what comes of it.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you all for attending today. A copy of the slides will be sent out with the recording of this presentation, and so thank you all for coming today. The next presentation is on the 20th of October, 2 weeks' time, and we'll have the presentation on the importance of peer support for those living with and affected by diabetes by Giovanna Taverna and Marge Devereaux, who are both involved in the peer support program of Diabetes Victoria, and we know that there's been keen interest in this. So thank you all, and thank you, Catherine, so much for taking the time to put this together. It was really, really of interest, and I must admit I do love that unconscious bias clip. And thank you all for attending, and we look forward to seeing you all here on the 20th of October. Thank you.
Thank you. Go well, everyone.
you.